The Christmas tree in my parents' living room had been the same one for 11 years. Artificial, pre-lit 6 feet tall, with the angel on top that leaned slightly to the left because my brother Marcus knocked it over in 2019 and no one ever fixed it. My mother called it charming. My father called it efficient. I called it what it was. A family that valued the appearance of tradition over the work of actually maintaining anything. I noticed the angle of that angel the moment I walked in on December 23rd, rolling my carry-on through the front door of the house I grew up in outside of Columbus, Ohio. I'd flown in from San Francisco. Nobody had offered to pick me up from the airport. I'd taken a rideshare as I always did, because asking for a ride felt like asking for something I didn't deserve, and I'd been trained for 29 years to believe that was exactly the case. "Naomi's here," Marcus announced from the couch, not looking up from his phone. He was 34, 2 years older than me, and he said my name the way some people announce that the mail has arrived. Informational. Mildly inconvenient. My mother emerged from the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel, and she smiled the way she always smiled at me, warmly enough to be considered affectionate, briefly enough to communicate that there were more important things to attend to. He kissed my cheek. She asked if my flight was fine. She turned back toward the kitchen before I finished answering. My father was in his office. He was always in his office. He came out for dinner. I put my bag in the guest room. The guest room, not my old room, which had been converted to a home gym, and I washed my face and I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. 30 years old. Composed. I had learned composure the hard way, the way you learn anything that doesn't come naturally, by needing it badly enough, long enough, that it eventually became part of your architecture. I went downstairs for dinner. The table was set the way it always was at Christmas. My mother's good china, the burgundy tablecloth, the centerpiece with the pillar candles that she lit every year and never let burn all the way down. Marcus was there with his wife, Diane, who was perfectly pleasant and who had long ago learned to be quietly neutral at family gatherings. My Aunt Patricia had driven up from Dayton. There was my father, Richard Calloway, 58 years old, silver at his temples, still carrying himself with the particular confidence of a man who had built something from nothing and never fully recovered from his own pride about it. Calloway Industrial Supply. Founded 1994. Regional distributor of commercial-grade equipment across the Midwest. 41 employees. $12 million in annual revenue at its peak. My father had built it through 20 years of cold calls and stubborn persistence, and he was legitimately proud of it. The problem was that his pride in the company had become inseparable from his contempt for anyone who hadn't built something equivalent. And the person he applied that contempt to most consistently was me. It started, as it usually did, with something small. "How's the job, Naomi?" Aunt Patricia asked, genuinely curious. She was the only person at the table who ever asked follow-up questions. "Good," I said. "Busy quarter. We closed a significant fund." "A fund," my father repeated. He was cutting his roast. He didn't look up. "What does that mean exactly?" "You work for someone else's fund." "I manage a portfolio," I said. "Private equity. I've explained this before." "Portfolio." He said the word the way someone might say hobby. "So you move money around for people?" "Essentially, yes." "Not the same as building something," he said. "Anyone can move numbers on a screen." Marcus smiled into his wine glass. "Richard," my mother said softly, the single word doing the work of both warning and permission. Warning him to soften it, permitting him to continue. "I'm not criticizing," my father said in the tone he used specifically when he was criticizing. "I'm saying there's a difference between understanding how a business actually operates, payroll, inventory, logistics, the real things, and sitting in an office in California deciding which companies to bet on. She has no idea how money actually works." He said it to the table. Not to me. To the table, as if I were a topic being discussed rather than a person sitting 4 feet away. 30 years old, he continued, and still playing pretend. My mother nodded. "It's honestly embarrassing," she said quietly, as if she were agreeing with something regrettable about the weather. I refilled my wine glass. I didn't say anything. I had learned a long time ago that saying anything accomplished nothing. My father didn't debate. He declared. And the only person who had ever pushed back on his declarations, really pushed back with evidence and consequence and permanence, was me. Just not in the way he expected. Not yet in a way he knew about. Marcus raised his glass slightly in a small, private toast to himself. Diane looked at her plate. Aunt Patricia changed the subject to her neighbor's new deck. I finished my wine. I helped clear the table. I wished everyone good night. In the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from effort but from restraint. From holding something still inside yourself when every instinct says to move. I had been holding something still for 6 years, and on nights like that one, alone in a room that used to belong to a piece of exercise equipment, in a house where I was a guest and a disappointment simultaneously, the weight of it pressed down in a way I didn't let myself feel anywhere else. I opened my laptop. Not to work. Just to have something concrete in front of me. The quarterly report for Callaway Industrial Supply was in a folder I rarely opened. I opened it anyway. Revenue down 8% year-over-year. Operating margin compressed. The equipment supply chain had never fully normalized post-pandemic, and my father, who distrusted consultants and outside advisors as a matter of principle, had not adapted quickly enough. The company wasn't failing, but it was walking the edge of a slower kind of decline that proud men rarely notice until it's steep. I closed the laptop. I turned off the light. I stared at the ceiling. 30 years old, he had said. Still playing pretend. I thought about what he would say when he found out. I had been thinking about that for 6 years. What his face would do. What words he would reach for. Whether, in that moment, any part of him would recognize how completely and specifically wrong he had been about me. I thought about it. Then I let it go the way I'd learned to let things go. I went to sleep. Let me go back. I need to tell you about Eleanor Marsh because nothing that happened later makes sense without her. I graduated from Ohio State in 2016 with a finance degree and approximately $11,000 in student loans that my parents had declined to help with, not because they couldn't, but because my father believed that financial difficulty built character and that anything given without struggle was wasted. Marcus had received a different version of this philosophy. His tuition had been covered entirely. When I pointed this out once at 22, my father said, "Marcus is going into the business. The investment makes sense." I was not going into the business. This had been made clear to me in multiple ways over many years. Not through argument but through the quieter method of simply never being included. Marcus sat in on meetings from the time he was 16. Marcus came to trade shows. Marcus understood the inventory system, the supplier relationships, the rhythm of the operation. I was not invited to any of that. When I asked as a teenager if I could help at the warehouse one summer, my father said he'd think about it. He never thought about it. So I graduated and I moved to Columbus and I got a job as a junior analyst at a regional investment firm called Greystone Capital Partners. The pay was modest. The work was relentless. And the person who noticed me, who actually looked at my work with real attention and told me what it meant, was Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor was 51 when I met her, a managing partner at Greystone with 30 years of private equity experience and the particular manner of someone who had been underestimated so many times that she had stopped noticing and started cataloging. She was precise, demanding, occasionally caustic, and she had no patience for people who confused performance with competence. She did, however, have extensive patience for people who were genuinely good at the work and simply hadn't been given room to demonstrate it. She gave me room. "You see things in the numbers that the others walk past," she told me after I'd been at Greystone for about 8 months. We were in her office at 7:30 on a Thursday night, going over a due diligence report on a Midwest manufacturing acquisition target. "You're not just analyzing what's there. You're modeling what's been missed. That's rarer than people think." I told her I'd grown up around a manufacturing business. "Tell me about it," she said. So I did. I told her about Callaway Industrial Supply and about my father, and about the particular education of watching a business operate for your entire childhood while being systematically excluded from understanding it. Eleanor listened the way she always listened, completely without offering sympathy, filing everything. "The exclusion taught you more than the inclusion would have," she said when I finished. "You learned to observe without a role. That's the most valuable skill in due diligence." He became my mentor. Then she became my professional model. Then, over years, she became the closest thing I had to the kind of adult figure who actually believed in my capacity. Not warmly, not in the way parents are supposed to, but practically, which was more useful. In 2019, Eleanor left Greystone to launch her own fund. She asked me to come with her. I left Columbus, moved to San Francisco and joined Marsh Capital Partners as a junior partner. I was 25. By 27, I was the firm's lead analyst on Midwest industrial acquisition targets, which meant I was, professionally, doing exactly what my father had said I was incapable of doing. Understanding how a business actually operates. Payroll, inventory, logistics. The real things. I need to explain how I came to own 74% of Callaway Industrial Supply, because it didn't happen in a single decision. It happened the way most significant things happen. In stages, each one reasonable on its own, the full shape only visible in retrospect. In 2020, Callaway hit a difficult patch. COVID supply chain disruption, 2 major clients pausing orders, cash flow tightening in ways my father's operating style had left him unprepared for. He needed a capital infusion. Marcus, by that point nominally a co-owner, didn't have liquid capital. My father, constitutionally opposed to banks and venture money on the grounds that no one gives you money without wanting something, was in a corner. Eleanor heard about it through a contact. He brought it to me. Interesting situation, she said. Regional industrial supply, solid fundamentals underneath the short-term distress. Owner-operated with a succession problem they haven't acknowledged yet. Anonymous investment vehicle. Minority stake at entry. I know the company, I said. Eleanor looked at me for a moment. How well? It's my father's. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, walk me through the numbers. I did. She listened. At the end she said, this is your call. I won't push either way. But if the financials justify it and you can manage the complexity, I see no reason it isn't a legitimate position. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I ran the numbers 17 different ways. The company was genuinely undervalued, genuinely viable, genuinely in need of capital that would be wasted if deployed without the operational discipline my father was unlikely to accept from a visible outside partner. An anonymous investment vehicle, a holding company with no visible connection to me, made structural sense independent of everything else. I also thought about my father's face at Christmas dinner 2019, when he told my cousin that I played at finance the way some people played at tennis. I thought about the guest room. I thought about the angel on top of the tree, leaning to the left that no one ever fixed. I called my attorney James Whitfield, a corporate lawyer Eleanor had introduced me to in 2018. I told him to structure the investment through a holding entity, Meridian Capital Ventures LLC. No connection to Naomi Callaway visible in any public filing. Minority stake 31% in exchange for $2.1 million in operating capital. My father, through his own attorney, reviewed the offer from Meridian Capital Ventures. He accepted it. He told Marcus it was smart institutional money. He never asked who was behind it. Over the following 3 years, as Callaway's cash needs continued and my father continued to resist raising outside capital through visible channels, Meridian made 2 additional investments. Each time the ownership percentage increased. Each time the terms were fair, not predatory, not punitive. I wasn't trying to trap him. I was making rational investment decisions on assets I understood better than anyone else on earth. By October 2023, Meridian Capital Ventures LLC held 74% of Callaway Industrial Supply. My father held the remaining 26%, which he described to anyone who asked as maintaining majority control through strategic partnership. He had no idea. I had never told Eleanor whether this felt good or felt terrible. Some days it felt like justice. Some days it felt like something I would have to carry for a very long time. Most days it felt simply like the truth, quiet, complete, and patient. The truth was always patient. I flew back to San Francisco on December 26th. The flight was smooth. I had a window seat which I preferred, and I watched Ohio disappear beneath the clouds, and I thought about almost nothing at all, which was the gift I gave myself on long flights. Back in my apartment, a 1-bedroom in the Mission with floor-to-ceiling windows and a bookshelf that took up an entire wall, I made tea and called my friend Daniela, who was the other constant in my life outside of work. Daniela was a pediatric physical therapist who had moved to San Francisco the same year I had, and we had met at a community pottery class in 2019 that neither of us had continued attending but which had produced a lasting friendship and several uneven bowls that we both still kept. How was the gauntlet? She asked. This was what she called Christmas with my family. Standard, I said. Dad announced at dinner that I have no idea how money works. In those words. More or less. And you said? I refilled my wine. She laughed. One of these days you're going to say something back and I desperately want to be in the room when it happens. You'll have to settle for the story afterward, I said. She asked about Marcus. I told her he'd smiled into his wine glass. He asked about my mother. I told her my mother had agreed with my father gently, the way she agreed with everything he said, not out of conviction I'd long decided, but out of a kind of practiced harmony that required no individual positions. My mother was not a cruel person. She was in some ways a lonely one. That was its own kind of loss, separate from everything else. I had a therapist, Dr. Anita Chung, who I'd been seeing for 4 years. Anita had helped me understand the distinction between the wound of being dismissed and the wound of never being known. She argued they were different injuries requiring different responses. Being dismissed, she said, could be answered. Being never known was something you had to grieve. I was still working through the second one. I had colleagues I genuinely liked. I had my running group, 6 people who met at 6 a.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays in Dolores Park, who knew nothing about my family and cared enormously about pace and weather. I had the pottery bowls and Daniela's voice on the phone and the bookshelf in the windows. I had a life. It was a good one. I had built it carefully, the way you build anything you plan to actually live in. None of that erased the Christmas table. But it meant the Christmas table was one room, not the whole house. The Tuesday after I returned, I sat in my office at Marsh Capital with the Callaway file open in front of me and I thought about what I was going to do. I had been thinking about it in some form since 2020. The question was never if. The question was when, and more importantly, why. Not revenge. I had worked carefully to ensure my motivation was not revenge, because revenge produces bad decisions and I had made a professional life out of avoiding bad decisions. The investment was legitimate. The majority stake was legitimately held. The question of disclosure was a separate one, and I had always known it would come, and I had always told myself it would come when there was a real reason beyond emotion. The Q3 report had shown the 8% revenue decline. The Q4 projections, which James had forwarded me, showed the trajectory worsening. My father was planning to expand into 2 new product categories: heavy automation equipment, which required capital investment and a sales team configuration he didn't have, without consulting the majority shareholder. Which was me. That was the reason. Not Christmas dinner. Not 30 years old and still playing pretend. The company needed strategic redirection, and the majority shareholder had both the right and the responsibility to ensure that direction was sound. That was the legitimate, professional, non-emotional reason. I called James Whitfield at 9:07 a.m. James, I said. It's time. Initiate the share transfer notice. All 74%. File it properly, full transparency. Meridian disclosed as holding entity with Naomi Callaway as controlling principal. I want it on record by end of day. James was quiet for a moment. He'd been my attorney for 6 years and he'd watched this build for all of them. He was not a sentimental man, but I heard something in his silence that might have been respect. Understood, he said. I'll have the formal disclosure prepared and submitted by 3 o'clock. Your father's registered agent will receive notification. His CFO will receive the shareholder letter. The CFO first, I said. Standard protocol. Standard protocol, he confirmed. I hung up. I sat at my desk for a moment. Then I opened the Callaway file, moved it from the private folder to the active folder, and began drafting the strategic memo I intended to present at the first official board meeting. I had a lot of thoughts about the automation expansion. My father's CFO was a man named Gerald Fitch, who had been with Callaway for 9 years and who was, by all accounts, competent, loyal, and constitutionally unsuited to bad news. James told me later that Gerald had read the shareholder letter twice, walked to my father's office, stood in the doorway for a full 30 seconds without speaking, and then said, "Richard, I need you to look at something." My father read the letter. Then he read it again. Then he called his attorney, who confirmed that Meridian Capital Ventures LLC had legally, properly, and thoroughly held 74% of Callaway Industrial Supply for the past 3 years, that all filings were in order, and that the controlling principal as of today's disclosure was one Naomi Callaway of San Francisco, California. My father called me at 2:17 p.m. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 2:19. I let that one go to voicemail too. I was in the middle of a legitimate conference call with 2 of Marsh Capital's other portfolio companies, And I had always believed that the most important calls deserved your full attention. At 3:45 when I was between meetings I called him back. He picked up on the first ring. "Is this some kind of joke?" he said. His voice was controlled. My father was always controlled, but there was something underneath it, something I'd never heard before. Not anger exactly. More like a man who has stepped on a stair that wasn't there and is still processing the sensation of falling. "No," I said. "It's not a joke. You're telling me that that Meridian, you've been the investor. Since 2020. Since April 2020, yes." Silence. He stopped. Started again. "That's $3.5 million. $3 million for 100,000 over 3 tranches," I said. "Plus the accumulated interest on the structured note portion. James can walk you through the full documentation if you'd like." More silence. "You never said anything." His voice had shifted. Something new in it. Not the tone he used at dinner tables when he was performing confidence for an audience. Something raw. "4 Christmases. You sat at that table and you never said. You told me I had no idea how money works," I said. Kept my voice even. I had practiced keeping my voice even. "You said it 4 days ago. You've been saying it in various forms for most of my adult life. I made a financial decision to invest in an asset I understood, through a proper legal structure with legitimate capital. I didn't disclose it because there was no legal obligation to do so and because," I paused. I chose the next words carefully. "Because I needed to know whether the company was worth investing in on its merits. Not because it was family. Not out of obligation. On its merits. It was." He was quiet for a long time. "What do you want?" he finally asked. "I want the same thing any majority shareholder wants," I said. "I want the company to be run well. I've reviewed the Q4 projections and I have significant concerns about the automation expansion. I'd like to schedule a board meeting within the next 3 weeks. I'll be bringing a strategic advisor." "A board meeting." He repeated it like it was in a foreign language. "You have 26%, Dad. I have 74. I've had 74 for over a year. You can bring your own counsel. James will handle the formal scheduling." Another silence. Then, "Marcus is going to." "Marcus will need to be there," I said. "Yes." I heard him exhale. It was a long exhale, the kind that carries something out of the body along with the air. "Naomi." My name in his mouth without the weight it usually carried. Just my name. Did you do this too?" "I did it because it was a good investment," I said. "And because I'm very good at this. Which you would have known if you'd ever asked." I let that land. "The board meeting invitation will come from James's office," I said. "I'll see you then." I ended the call. I set the phone on my desk. I looked out the window at the San Francisco skyline, the light coming in low and gold in the late afternoon, and I waited to feel something decisive. Triumphant or relieved or finished. Something that closed. I didn't feel finished. I felt like a person who had done a necessary thing and now had to live in the aftermath of it, which is always more complicated than the thing itself. The board meeting was held in Columbus on January 17th, at the offices of Whitfield and Associates. I flew in the day before. I didn't stay at my parents' house. I stayed at the Hilton downtown, a room on the 14th floor with a view of the river, and I ordered room service and read through my strategic memo one final time and went to bed at 10. Marcus called me that night. I answered. "Is this real?" he said. He sounded less like his usual self. Less smooth, less positioned. He sounded like someone who had just learned that the floor of a room was a different material than he thought. "Yes," I said. "Since 2020. Yes." "And Dad had he never looked closely enough," I said. Not unkindly. "He assumed the investor was institutional. He didn't investigate. He trusted the paperwork without reading the underlying entity structure." Marcus was quiet. "Then, why?" It was a genuine question. I could tell because it had no armor on it. "Because I understood the business better than anyone else he would have accepted money from," I said. "And because I wanted to see if it could be saved. On its own terms." "And can it?" "That's what the meeting is for," I said. He hung up. I finished my tea. I thought about what Anita would say about this. About the strange simultaneous feeling of power and grief. The way winning something can still feel like losing something else, something you didn't even know you were still hoping for. The hope may be that it would have gone differently. That you wouldn't have had to do any of this to be seen. That was the thing that didn't close. Not the company, not the investment, not the confrontation. The hope. What you do with it once it's no longer something you can pretend is still possible. The meeting lasted 3 hours. My father arrived with his attorney and his CFO. Marcus arrived alone, which surprised me, and sat across from me at the conference table without speaking, but looked at me steadily in a way he never had before, like he was recalibrating something. My strategic advisor, Elena Voss, who had spent 15 years in industrial supply chain restructuring, was at my right. James was at my left. My father looked older than he had at Christmas. Or maybe he just looked his age finally without the performance. I presented the strategic memo. Elena walked through the operational recommendations. The automation expansion was paused, pending a proper market analysis. 2 underperforming product lines were flagged for review. A restructured supplier agreement, which I had spent 2 weeks negotiating in advance, was presented for approval. It would reduce cost of goods by approximately 11% in the first year. My father asked questions. Genuine ones. Not the rhetorical kind he used at dinner tables. He challenged 2 of Elena's projections. He was right about one of them and I said so, and he pushed back on the supplier restructuring timeline, and we negotiated it to a 6-month implementation rather than 4. It was stripped of everything else, a functional business meeting. 2 people who understood a company, arguing about how to make it better. If you had walked in without context, you would have assumed it was a normal shareholder discussion. At the end, my father gathered his papers slowly, the way people do when they're delaying the moment of standing up. He looked at me. The 2020 investment, he said. The terms were fair. Yes, I said. You could have structured them differently. Predatory. He wasn't accusing me. He was acknowledging something. That wasn't what I wanted, I said. He nodded slowly. Something moved through his expression. Not quite an apology, not quite acknowledgement, not quite anything I could name cleanly. It was the expression of a man confronting the gap between the story he had told about someone and the person who had actually been standing there. You should have told me who you were, he said. You should have asked, I said. We looked at each other across the conference table. 30 years of it in the space between us. Not resolved. Not collapsed. Just present finally with no performance wrapped around it. I gathered my own papers. I shook Gerald's hand and Elena's hand. I nodded to Marcus. At the door I paused. Not for effect. Just because a thought arrived that needed to be said. The company is good, Dad, I said. It was always good. It just needed someone to believe that who wasn't too proud to see what was actually happening to it. I didn't look back. I walked out into the January cold, the Ohio wind sharp off the river, and I got into the waiting car and I looked out the window as Columbus moved past me, familiar and distant at the same time. My phone buzzed. Daniela, how did it go? I typed back, it went. She sent a single emoji, a small flame. I looked out the window. The city gave way to highway. The highway gave way to airport. I had a 4 p.m. flight back to San Francisco, back to the 14th floor and the bookshelf and the running group and the life I had built on my own, from nothing, from the gap left by not being included, which had turned out, as Eleanor once told me it might, to be the most useful education of all. My father had called me the family disappointment at Christmas. He had said it to the table. Not to me. He had no idea. He does now. Some people spend their lives waiting for the people who dismissed them to finally see them clearly. I understand that impulse. I lived inside it for years. What I learned, slowly, imperfectly, with Anita's help and Eleanor's example and Daniela's steady presence, is that being seen by the right people is more sustaining than being seen by the ones who weren't looking. My father will adjust. He may even in time change. I don't hold the outcome of that tightly. The company will run better. The restructuring will take hold. Gerald will stop having panic attacks probably. Marcus and I have had 3 phone calls since the meeting. Real ones, uncomfortable ones, the kind that are actually going somewhere. My mother called me on a Sunday in February. She asked if my flight home had been fine. She asked about the weather in San Francisco. Then she paused for longer than usual and she said, I didn't know. About the investment. Your father told me after. I know, I said. Another pause. You were always cleverer than we gave you credit for. It was not an apology. It was not enough. But it was the first true sentence she had said to me in longer than I could calculate, and it arrived with all the complicated weight of things that come too late to be what you needed them to be when you needed them, but are still somehow worth receiving. I know that too, I said. We talked for 20 minutes. It was the longest phone call we'd had in years. I don't know what that becomes. I know what I've built and what it cost and what remains. I know that some doors close in ways that change the shape of everything that comes after. Not just the doors themselves, but the rooms you end up in when you finally stop looking back at them. The tree in my parents' living room still has the angel that leans to the left. No one has fixed it. Maybe this year.